So good morning, everybody. Welcome to the second session of the DSA Rising Powers Study Group sessions on South-South relations, on settling development. We had a really good discussion yesterday afternoon on Southern multilateralism, trilateral cooperation, development, and BRICS countries and their development cooperation. Today, we have a group of two sessions. This afternoon, we will have a group of papers related to South-South and COVID-19 in particular, a bit more focused on trade and including medical and pharmaceutical industry. This morning, we're really excited to have three papers that are related to particularly China and China's external or broader South-South relations. We'll have the three papers. After each of the three papers, we'll have time for Q&A and discussion, just like yesterday. And so without further ado, we'd like to move into the first paper, which is Mei, Farid, and Hui Li, both from University of Hong Kong, one in Hong Kong and one currently in California, in the middle of the night. So great to thank you so much for joining at this time. So Northern Actors in South-South Development Cooperation, how INGOs in China facilitate and shape China's outbound development efforts. Welcome, Hui Li and Mei, and please take away your presentation.
Thank you so much, Rory. It's great to be here. Is it working? Can you see my screen?
Yes.
Great. So we're excited to share what we've been working on today with participants here. This is kind of a new project and a new area for Hui and I. We both focus more, we have focused more in the past on state NGO relations and on Chinese politics more specifically. And what we're presenting today has really represents kind of us being pulled into a new area, not fully expectedly. So it's kind of a new area for us, and so we'd really welcome feedback, from participants. So, we don't need to dwell too much on the landscape of what we're going to be discussing today. So we focus on international NGOs, which are seen as actors, generally defined as civil society organizations that are headquartered in one location and operate in another. We're just defining them very broadly in that way. But such organizations, INGOs, have played traditionally an important role in North-South development. So they're seen as really actors that spread liberal norms, that can encourage democratization and foster development, and really a conduit for North-South development. And with the rise of new powers and this changing landscape of North-South development and the rise of South-South cooperation, what is really the role of these INGOs in the context of South-South cooperation? And, there are some studies that are beginning to look at trilateral cooperation and different modes of interaction with these types of organizations. And in fact, yesterday's presentation, I think by Cynthia, was really interesting and I think had a lot of intersections with what we're looking at from the Zambian perspective, but really, how are these Northern donors interacting in South-South cooperation? And for us, a big part of the picture is China's going out strategy. So as China's globalizing efforts have really built momentum over the past couple of decades, now Chinese foreign aid outpaces the US. We saw some of this also with Pippa's presentation yesterday. China's growing role in outbound aid and investment, and building a new architecture for global governance also, which was addressed yesterday. in the presentation, and the launch of this new Belt and Road Initiative, which now embraces 140 countries globally. And there are diverse actors in China's outbound strategy. So of course we have government actors, we have private firms, state-owned firms, some of the big major sectors in the economy, infrastructure and resource extraction. But a lot of these firms, as they're going out, have faced challenges in terms of engagement with local communities, and as we've seen, have gotten significant pushback. And so NGOs have really been introduced into the equation very consciously, being seen as having the potential to soften China's image abroad. Primarily, this has been achieved through the involvement of government-organized NGOs, so Chinese NGOs that are kind of government-backed, although there are some other types of NGOs too. But these organizations are really inexperienced in terms of cross-border development work. You also have such critical perspectives of China's outbound expansion, as we've seen. We have charges of land grabbing, of rogue aid, and that diplomacy. Of course, we have studies that call into question some of these memes, as we've seen, but negative perceptions really do persist. And so how can INGOs play a role in this process? While traditionally, there is this perception of INGOs as being the moral conscience of a globalized world, as being principled actors that are animated by global norms, INGOs, our findings show, have really been facilitating China's development efforts abroad. So our research question was, in what way are INGOs acting as intermediaries in China's going out strategy? Our theoretical orientation, we look at this concept of intermediaries, which does appear, in the literature, but in terms of INGOs' general role in global governance, in norm transmission, resource mobilization, and promoting kind of global cultural standards. And in terms of INGOs' responses to their resource and institutional environment, we have kind of been mapping how these elements are spurring INGOs in China to take on this new role in terms of China's going out strategy. So we're really looking at intermediaries as third-party agents that are connecting two more disparate entities. Again, we saw this in the presentation yesterday, but there are high transaction costs when some of these Chinese actors seeking to go out want to interact with their counterparts in South-South cooperation, and a lot of uncertainty in that process. And so how do intermediaries play different roles? And there's some research generally on how organizational intermediaries can play a number of roles in terms of supporting market infrastructure, in terms of driving innovation and collaboration. They can facilitate policy implementation and really broker accountability between parties and provide legitimacy to social enterprises. So we're really looking at how international NGOs, which roles they are playing in South-South cooperation. So our data and methods, we conducted about 30-something semi-structured interviews between 2019 and 2021 with international NGOs based in China, with an office in China. We looked at annual reports, news reports, and published interviews as well related to these INGOs. And these INGOs really represented a range of headquarters. So most were probably headquartered in the United States. Some were headquartered in Europe, and would be operating in different, yeah, we had a couple headquartered also in Hong Kong and in Macau, but these organizations were all had been working in China. And we took a grounded theory approach in the research. And actually, we initially didn't set out necessarily to look at this question of INGO interaction in South-South cooperation. We had initially, aimed to look at the impact of a restrictive law that had come out a couple of years ago, seeking to regulate foreign NGO activity in China. And but we found that 81% of the INGOs we interviewed happened to be involved now in facilitating China's going out strategy. So we saw a big shift in focus from a lot of these organizations that had previously been working on development issues domestically within China, turning their attention towards facilitating China's outbound development. And there are really three intersecting causes for this: government pressure, this global constricting space for INGOs, and this need to kind of find a new niche. And then, there have been ambivalent attitudes towards INGOs and international involvement in domestic development issues on the part of the Chinese government. And then, as I mentioned, this new overseas NGO management law in 2017. And so our interviewees were really reporting that, they were getting some pressure from supervisory departments when they were trying to register under this new law, that they needed to demonstrate significant overlap with the priorities of their supervisory agencies. And because of this global going out strategy, these priorities often reflected going out. And so they eventually were bringing these INGOs were bringing their mission more in line with this underlying trend. They also received, surprisingly, pressure from their own stakeholders, their own headquarters in northern countries, kind of pushing them to get in on the game, essentially, of China's outbound expansion. So funders and investors were asking about this as well as Chinese grantees. So they would be giving grants to Chinese NGOs who would be seeking to really go abroad. But the biggest one really, I think, was this redefined value add. So, they mentioned the tables have turned. So INGOs were historically maybe valued providers for China of access, of expertise, and even of funds. And this really is no longer the case with China's changing role. And so what really prompted something of an existential crisis for these organizations. What really is our role now in China's development? And what it needs, as many reported, is doesn't need resources or expertise, but needs help thinking about how to play its role in the global economy. And I will hand it over now to Hui.
Can you pause sharing, please?
Yeah.
Okay, thank you. Okay, can you see my presentation? So we look at, so our findings show that INGOs play 4 different roles. And when conceptualizing these different roles, we look at 2 different dimensions. One is the content of intermediary support, which distinguishes tangible resources from intangible resources. So tangible resources would include the money that they bring in, the expertise, the capacity building efforts, or the technical assistance. So the intangible resources would include the knowledge, the connections, the innovations and models or norms that they're trying to do. Another dimension that we look at is about the function of the intermediary. So we look at the bridging function versus initiating function. So by tabulating these two different dimensions, we have a typology of 4 different intermediary roles. We'll go over each role in the following. So the first one we look at is bridging tangible resources. So our interviewees, respondents were saying that the Chinese foreign aid projects are often carried out in 3 siloed projects, which includes economic cooperation, material assistance, and technical assistance. And the INGOs' work is to help these 3 areas to interact and become more systematic. So for example, INGOs, they can coordinate resources and expertise from different actors, such as donors, universities, think tanks, and intergovernmental organizations. They coordinate resources and then bring them in the going out efforts. Okay, I don't have time to go over the quotes. Okay, so one INGO, for example, they organize a conference on biodiversity and coordinate efforts between environmental bodies and domestic actors, for example. So the second role is about bridging intangible resources, which would include the synthesizing knowledge and connecting actors. So as we mentioned earlier, one of the biggest gaps that these Chinese actors face in the going out efforts is about community engagement. They don't have enough capacity to speak the local language, understand the local culture. They also don't know the local conditions. So INGOs, they play various roles to help the Chinese actors to bridge the different actors together. So first of all, they serve as hubs for synthesizing and disseminating knowledge about outbound development. So they have created institutionalized platforms for dialogue between Chinese NGOs and their counterparts in these aid receiving countries. They also have gathered knowledge by researching Chinese aid programs and disseminated through case studies. They also bring community voice to the Chinese actors. For example, one INGO, they convene the space so that Chinese NGOs and the think tanks, they can work with the overseas grassroots stakeholders to study and mitigate the environmental impacts of their Chinese investments. Another bridging intangible resources is about they can broker trusted partnerships with community organizations, because oftentimes Chinese actors don't know who to work with. So these INGOs, they serve as relationship guarantees. They could say, okay, this is the local partner that are reliable that you can work with. So they serve as brokers. So after talking about the 2 bridging roles, we now move on to the third role, which is initiating tangible resources. As we mentioned, Chinese government funding is usually divided into functional areas, so there's not much interaction. So INGOs could either coordinate resources or they could provide these resources themselves. So by initiating tangible resources, they can provide like specialized funding, which can help jumpstart aid projects. They can incentivize Chinese personnel and host country staff so that they can work collaboratively on projects. They can also help maintain the projects and empower local organizations. Chinese actors don't have capacity to go abroad. So in response, these international NGOs, they provide trainings to different outbound actors to enhance their capacity. So they provide training to government officials, for example, like those from the National Poverty Alleviation Office, to learn about international standards and norms. They also train these people from state-owned enterprises and private companies so that they know the environmental impacts, for example, of their investments, so that they could be more compliant to local conditions. They also train domestic NGOs. So for example, several INGOs work together to compile a training manual for Chinese NGOs so that they have a guideline when going out. So the last intermediary role that INGOs play is the initiating intangible resources. So this would include, well, as we said, one of the problem for Chinese going out is about lack of soft power. They don't know how to present their stories or to promote their development projects. So Chinese INGOs, they can model innovations in outbound projects so that they know what projects work best, are more effective. They develop institutions. For example, one INGO developed a grievance mechanism to allow local civil society to articulate their grievances to Chinese financial institutions. They also tell China's story to the world because as this interviewee said, the government wants us to bring China development experiences to the world. So we serve as a middleman or medium. Many INGOs also share that they're kind of engaging in a form of diplomatic activity by facilitating lower level bilateral collaboration between local governments and the other actors. They're engaging in track 2 diplomacy. So we know that INGOs play multiple roles, intermediary roles in the process. So what are the implications for INGOs to serve as these intermediaries? Our interviews show that the INGOs face 3 different paradoxes. So I don't have enough time to elaborate, sorry. So one is about the conflicts between domestic and international work. It's about, so these INGOs were intentionally intended to work within China, and now they are pulled out to work internationally. So they are really spreading their resources very thin and diverting their mission. Another one is about their legitimacy. So we know that INGOs they have legitimacy because they are politically independent. And now they're trying to facilitate China's going out. So some people are wondering, like, are you speaking truth to China, or are you speaking for China or speaking truth? Are you extending your legitimacy to the Communist Party and giving them legitimacy and paying for it? What would that affect your own reputation and legitimacy? So the third one is about the impact that these intermediaries are trying to make. Are they really facilitating China's outbound effort, or they can exert some kind of influence? Some people are worried that, well, we're too tiny, we don't have enough influence on China's effort. We cannot shape China's global investment to be a more responsible actor. But some others were saying that, well, we actually can do something to exert some influence. We could code or label sensitive topics wisely. So to get some work done. Okay, last slide, sorry. So in this study, we have tried to look at why and how INGOs participate in China's going out strategy. So we conceptualized 4 intermediary roles that INGOs have played in the process. So we have 2 cautions. One is that these intermediary roles are neither mutually independent nor time-bound. So one organization can play one role at a time point and then move on to another role. So this could evolve over time. And another point is that one organization could play multiple intermediary roles simultaneously. So for example, they could be bridging, or they could initiating together. So in terms of future direction, so as May said, we are kind of new to the field of INGOs and development, and we are thinking about like which journal is a better fit for our paper. And we're also thinking about expanding the current project into a broader field. For example, like quantitatively testing why Chinese NGOs and international NGOs go out, and how what kind of impact they have been making in these Chinese aid receiving countries. So welcome your comments. Thank you.
Thank you, Hui and Mei. Really great presentation, which clearly positions the sort of the changing role of INGOs in relation to China's changing development status and China's increasing, well, rising power, or clearly beyond the rising power now, the major power. So we're going to open it up for questions. Great if you are willing to use the blue hand in the to signal your that you'd like to ask a question, but if you would like to as well, feel free to pose a question in the chat. We'll take 2 or 3 questions, hopefully. First is Joe. Joe, you've changed your name. You've changed your name today.
I worked out what he'd done. Thank you for noticing. Yeah, I know.
For anybody who doesn't know, Joe appeared under her son's name yesterday on the name, so that's what this joke is about. Anyway, we'll get back to it.
They know their way around the computer in a way that I just don't really. But yeah, thank you so much. Really interesting presentation, and you're really raising such key points. There was a comment that I wasn't sure whether I understood you correctly, because I thought you'd said that INGOs previously had been sort of politically neutral, and the concern was that they were aligning themselves with these sort of Chinese priorities. Well, I might have misunderstood the point, because INGOs are largely, getting the lion's share of their funding from Western governments. For example, when you see the difficulty that Oxfam have had trying to get back the funding and losing it again and so on. So I would certainly contest the idea that INGOs are politically neutral and not aligned to the Western governments that they do have a great deal of funding from. So is the concern that they are under a bit of an existential threat at the moment in some ways, because INGOs are being, and charity and this type of activity is being questioned in a way that it never was, because it was good people doing good things, so it never used to be challenged in this same way. And now with a lot of scandals and an awareness of the politicization, it's more scrutinized. Are you raising the possibility that because of this existential threat, INGOs are willing to align themselves with China's intentions as a way of defending their flank against potentially losing Western support?
Thanks, Joe. Would anybody else like to raise their hand? Okay, we'll take Barnaby, and then there'll be 2 questions in the chat, which if Hui and Mei, you can read those when you come to them. I won't bother repeating them. So Barnaby, and then we'll pass back to Hui and Mei for both these questions and those in the chat.
Yeah, thanks for an interesting presentation. I had sort of one question similar to Joe, which was again about this sort of NGO state relationship, and wondering a little bit more about how that works out in the China case, of how independent the INGOs feel they can be in that relationship, and how that's changing over time. So, sort of building from what Joe said, one sort of the interesting comments you made was that they're feeling like they're just becoming a sort of part of the diplomatic sort of ranks of organizations sort of supporting China's diplomacy. So maybe that would also be a way in which you could sort of develop this for journals and things in the future, but exploring that relationship and how that's changing over time, and how much independence they really have. And then the related question I had was one about sort of this question of China's integration and convergence with global norms and sort of practices that perhaps have been more associated with the West, to be sort of generalizing. And I was wondering which areas from your work, sort of which areas they seem to have gone further in that regard, and if there's still sort of an uneven pattern in that convergence, or whether it's sort of more universal across a number of different areas, and yeah, just sort of wondering where that pattern is taking them. So yeah, thanks very much.
Okay, thanks, Barnaby. A quick one from Indrajit, and then we have 3 in the chat, so I think that'll add up to at least about 7 questions for you both to deal with. So Indrajit?
I can wait if you'd like me to, and I can come back in the next round, Rory. Whatever you say.
If it's on this paper, come now, and we'll just do them all in one.
No, it's fascinating. Thank you so much for this paper. I had one question and one suggestion. The question was to do with the INGOs and where they can raise funds from. Is it the case that INGOs can raise money in China, or is that not the case, or is that not a possibility at all? Because it may be that they are trying to expand their donor base and seek funds from China, but it's not an area I know anything about. So I just wondered if you had any thoughts. In terms of suggestions, you've already referred to the the socialization in international relations literature, and there's a great deal of work being done on norm localization and reciprocal socialization. One scholar you could look at is Peg Murray Evans, and her work. So that's just by way of suggestions, but it's a great paper. Thank you so much.
Thanks, Indrajit. So let me pass back to Hui and May, and let me give you maybe take 3-4 minutes between the two of you to deal with as many of those as you'd like to and can do in that time, if that's okay, and then we'll move on to the next paper.
May, do you want to go first?
Sure. Yeah. So maybe I'll take a crack at the first couple of questions. I think this is really one, I think Joe and Barnaby both hit on one of the core questions in this whole complex scenario, which is the question of political alignment, independence, who's speaking for who. And it's really, I think it's not quite so simple. It's a complex one because, and this does tie into what Indrajit asked about the donor base. So these INGOs are funded, as Joe mentioned, from northern, governments and global civil society. They can't actually raise funds within China, generally speaking, under this law. And the law is really aiming to keep foreign influence in China's domestic issues at bay. And so this is, the question of China's domestic political situation, the constricting political space is key to this. And I think it's, for me, I think what came out very clearly, what's in it for the international NGOs is just simply keeping a foot in the game. So keeping some skin in the game. And I think this does tie into, even the presentations yesterday. What is the role of Northern actors in South-South cooperation? This is a really interesting, I think, question that deserves to be explored a little bit more. And there are two perspectives on it. Are these Northern actors facilitating really the adoption of global environmental and governance, norms for South-South cooperation, infusing this into South-South cooperation? Or are they really becoming conduits and spokespersons for soft power, the expansion of soft power from rising actors? And they really are between a rock and a hard place, because they are facing pressures from, Southern or, rising powers such as China, but they also from their home governments, and they also have, they're kind of damned if you do, damned if you don't. They're stuck in this bind. So it is really a very interesting. So I hope that addressed some of the questions. Maybe Hui can address others. Yeah.
Okay, so I will address some of the questions from the chat. From Anna, so what is the role of local NGOs? Well, actually, as May mentioned at the very beginning, our paper, well, we had this project. Initially, we were focusing on how INGOs respond to the foreign INGO law in China in 2017. Are they exiting or are they staying in China? So we did interviews and found out that these INGOs, they're doing different things. Well, many of them are participating in China's going out strategy because of the increasing China's global investment. And so when going out, NGOs, Chinese NGOs are part of the going out strategy. So they went out to many different countries, but they did not have enough capacity to communicate with local NGOs. So these INGOs, they serve as kind of the connector between Chinese NGOs and the local NGOs in the aid receiving countries. So what do they do? What kind of participation do they have? Do INGOs have? To Soyan's question. So one example is about the grievance mechanism that I mentioned briefly. So because Chinese investment or companies, they have their infrastructure projects and many other mining projects, and they have a lot of community resistance. So initially their response was to, oh, okay, I can hire a PR company to help me fix the problem. And then they realized, well, they couldn't fix it. So how do they solve these? How do they work with the community? So the Chinese government, they thought about using INGO as an access point, because these INGOs, they have, for example, they have their local offices in Thailand or in Myanmar. And then these offices, they know the local organizations very well. So these INGOs, they that have offices in China, they communicate with their office in Thailand, and then help the Chinese government to sort out the interaction, the collaboration with the community to solve the resistance issue from the community.
If it's okay, either very quick, or else we can also come back to some of these questions after all the papers if there's time. So maybe just 1 more minute, if that's okay, and then if there's any more you'd like to take.
Oh, I will just answer through chat then.
Okay, great. Oh, you'll answer in the chat by writing?
I will type. Yeah, I'll type.
Okay, great. But if we can also come back to them if there's time at the end of all the 3 papers to discuss.
Yeah, sure.
Okay. So thanks so much. Really great set of comments, as well as a great presentation, a really rich discussion to start the morning. So we'll now move on to the second paper, which is Christina. Christina, are you okay to,
Yep.
Christina Wolf, are you okay to start? So Christina's from Kingston University, and we'll be talking about construction. Over to you.
Right. Well, thank you very much for the introduction, and thank you very much for having me. Great to see, so to speak, so many familiar faces, and great to get to know everyone else. Right. So the Africa report in April this year had titled a headline saying, "If Africa is to have its roaring 20s, infrastructure needs to come first." But what exactly is the economic significance of the construction sector? And that's the question I want to address in this paper at the example of the African construction boom, in which Chinese firms and construction projects have played a major role. And I want to explore this question in particular in relation to structural transformation. So can construction be a springboard to industrialization? We're going to look at the question at the example of Angola, Nigeria, and Ethiopia, which have seen the largest volume of Chinese construction projects over the past 2 decades. And what I'll show is that Chinese construction projects have been an important catalyst for structural transformation, both because they've provided critical infrastructure for the production sector, but also because they supported the formation of demand for manufactured goods in the first place, for building materials, but through multiplier effects from there. So employment on construction projects and in the capital goods industry, sort of widening the market for basic consumer goods, in particular food and beverages. But the emerging capitalist interests in the building materials manufacturing sector are shaped by and have reshaped the domestic political economy dynamics. And disentangling those, we can see a couple of dysfunctionalities in the process of structural transformation. And what I'll show is that these dysfunctionalities come out in particular out of the way in which distributional conflicts have been handled. Right. So construction is an essential part of the Chinese economy. China has been urbanizing at historically unprecedented speed over the past 30 years and correspondingly has seen a breathtaking growth of its own construction sector. So for instance, cement consumption in China is 10 times what it is in the UK. And construction is also a very significant yet understudied, certainly for economists, form of engagement between China and sub-Saharan African economies. So Chinese construction firms have internationalized from their base in China and became dominant players in Africa. So by 2017, they controlled about 60% of the African construction sector. And in terms of magnitude, Chinese engagement through construction projects is actually more important than Chinese firms coming in through FDI. So here in the dark black line, we see the annual value of construction projects completed each year by Chinese firms in Africa, and that amounts to a peak of about 45 billion in 2014. Since then, it's been coming down a bit to 36 billion in 2019. But that compares to, well, something in between 2 and 5 billion of FDI flows, annual FDI flows of Chinese firms. What's also significant is that the stocks of Chinese FDI only overtake these flows of construction projects by 2017. So they're certainly very important, of course, obviously intertwined as well with Chinese FDI. And in terms of the countries which have seen the most construction projects over the past 2 decades, that will be Angola, Nigeria, and Ethiopia. And more generally, the construction sector has played an important part in sub-Saharan Africa's development patterns since the turn of the century. So in this table, we see average real annual growth rates by sector for a couple of developing regions. And what we see is that the construction sector over the past 2 decades has grown faster than GDP for all developing regions. But this trend is most pronounced in sub-Saharan Africa, where the construction sector growth rates have been about 3 percentage points above that of GDP. And the construction sector has also grown faster than any other in any other developing region, and even ahead of the BRICS. Now, manufacturing performance is mixed at best. So the growth rates of manufacturing have picked up, certainly when compared to the 1990s. But in the early 2000s, they were still among the lowest in the developing world. They have picked up a little bit since then, since 2010. But once again, any indicators of structural change show that sub-Saharan Africa is lagging far behind any other region. So what is and can be the role of the construction sector in supporting structural transformation? Now, intersectoral supply and demand chains are important in sustaining maintaining late industrialization, and there is a huge literature on that, both theoretical and empirical, but mostly in relation to agriculture. Right? But what I want to show is that there are important causal links between construction and manufacturing through the supply side, mainly through a reduction of production costs, but also through the demand side, so spurring demand for building materials and then triggering multiplier effects from there. So we've got Chinese lending, which facilitates government spending on infrastructure, that increases demand for building materials, can, I should say, trigger investment in building materials manufacturing. Together, employment on the construction projects and building materials industries can have consumption multiplier effects by widening the consumer market for basic consumer goods, such as food and beverages, and this can in turn trigger again investment in consumer goods production. Now, what we'll see is that the process is very fragile, so it can break down both on maintaining government spending, but also what we'll see is that these multiplier effects in the context of the cases that we're looking at are fairly limited and certainly very fragile. Now, in Nigeria, the building materials manufacturing has really been transformative, and Dangote and the Bua Group have been in the news back and forth. And even if structural transformation across the economy as a whole in Nigeria is limited, very important business interests have formed from this building materials sector and moved into other forms of manufacturing from there. So Dangote and Bua, for instance, both have other lines of businesses in food processing and more recently in oil refining and fertilizer production. And we can see this when we look at the capital stock of building materials manufacturing firms listed on the Nigerian Stock Exchange. And this figure here shows us an index of the capital stock, where 2008 is 100, and since 2008, the capital stock in the building materials firms has increased by a factor of more than 30, right? And this comes against an already fairly strong growth of the capital stock in other sectors, in food and beverages, which have increased by a factor of about 5. And we can see similar importance of the building materials sector in the other two cases as well. Even in Ethiopia, which we think about more dominated by its apparel and export-oriented industries, but actually, when we look at the UNIDO data by breakdown of industrial subsector, we see that building materials and associated is actually by 2013 the second most important sector in terms of output after food and beverage production. And in terms of employment, I should add, in 2013, which is when the data stopped, building materials and associated actually employed the largest number of people, roughly double textile and apparel. And in Angola, structural change was most limited in the 3 case studies, but we see that non-metallic minerals, which is essentially cement, is indeed the largest subsector, followed by a bit of food and beverage production, and then very few other sectors. Now, I promised to go a little bit into the political economy of this. So Nigeria is the largest and most prominent producer of cement in sub-Saharan Africa, outcompeting the large European multinationals who had previously dominated the African cement production sector, Lafarge and Heidelberg Cement. But Ethiopia is actually the second largest cement producer, and Angola, at least up until 2014, when oil prices collapsed, followed a similar pattern to Ethiopia. Now, the comparison between these countries is interesting because both Angola and Nigeria faced similar type of economic crisis after the collapse in oil prices in 2014, but with very different recovery trajectories. And both Angola and Ethiopia actually faced leadership transitions from within their ruling coalition, but with very different economic and political outcomes. Right, so in Angola, under former President Dos Santos, all new business opportunities that were emerging in relation to the construction boom were very tightly controlled by circles close to the president's family and political allies. The most striking or prominent example of that being the business empire of his daughter Isabel Dos Santos, which comprised, among other, cement interests. Now, with the change in leadership to Lorenzo in 2017, one way in which Lorenzo tried to maintain the legitimacy of the MPLA was to crack down on corruption. And that has been successful to an extent, with assets being frozen, etc. But this leaves a field wide open for other elites aligned to Lorenzo to move in. Not really, because the profitability of the manufacturing sector was severely undermined, with a collapse in demand both for building materials and consumer goods. And that comes out really out of these two things, right? Maintaining government spending, but also in terms of these multiplier effects, these consumption multiplier effects. So it was difficult to maintain government spending after the oil price shock, and that was not just a price effect, but also due to the declining productivity of Angola's deep water oil fields, right, with production dropping steadily since 2014 to just under 1.2 million barrels a day, and I've plotted Nigeria's production as a comparator, right? But there was also a very sharp deterioration in living standards, which has been an ongoing problem since independence, essentially, but which has been an ongoing problem of structural transformation in Angola. Right. In Nigeria, as I said, very important business interests have formed with Dangote and BUA, and these were, not just limited to cement, but also moving into sugar, salt, rice production, and later, recently, into fertilizer and oil refining. And these business interests are really thriving and under changing ruling coalitions as well. So even after the election of Buhari's APC. Now, industrial policy in Nigeria has incentivized the merchant capitalist class with roots in the colonial era, such as Dangote and BUA, to transition into capitalist accumulation, but it left various tensions unresolved, which there was very little support for the backwardly linked industries in the supply chain and the agricultural sector. There was also a disproportionate rise in profits relative to wages and subsistence communities. So the headline figure here is that average wages per employee in Dangote Cement in 2018 were actually lower than what they were in 2011, even though the company's profit more than trebled, right? And that made the demand base very fragile. And in Nigeria, what we see is also capitalist interests opposed to rentier or merchant capitalist interests. Certainly, most recently with Dangote's and Bua's move into oil refining, which is opposed to persisting interests of the fuel, the refined petroleum importers, which are heavily subsidized in Nigeria through the fuel subsidies scheme, and there's a political back and forth trying to abandon the subsidy scheme and to reform the petroleum sector. Now, Nigeria was able to maintain government spending more than Angola was by actually then turning more towards Chinese lending after the oil price crisis in 2014. So it avoided parts of these problems of the G breaking down, but it has similar issues of the consumption multiplier effect remaining limited and certainly very crisis prone when economic crisis, such an oil crisis, hit, right? So it basically doesn't leave much more room for other manufacturing to emerge beyond these big building materials and associated conglomerates. Right, so in Ethiopia, there are more than 20 cement producers. The largest include Dangote Ethiopia, Durba Midrock, controlled by Alamudi, Mugo, which is an SOE, and Mesebo, which is an effort, so the endowment fund for the rehabilitation of Tigray, and various smaller producers, including Chinese producers. Now, interestingly, Ethiopia actually is in a situation where production lags behind demand, despite sufficient capacity. And when we dig into the cement sector, we really see a couple of the dysfunctionalities in Ethiopia's structural transformation process, in particular in the way it manages regional distributional struggles. So ethno-national self-determination is sort of the cornerstone of Ethiopian politics and the political practice and settlement. And within that system, the former ruling coalition, the EPRDF, was dominated by the TPLF, the Tigray People Liberation Front, and the TPLF was able to legitimize its domination by delivering on economic growth and structural transformation, on a huge structural transformation agenda. But obviously, it was strikingly difficult to try to maintain its domination while sort of delivering parts of the fruit to others, to the other groups and regions. And the effort, including Mesebo Cement, was actually one vehicle through which the TPLF faction within the EPRDF monopolized access to rents across multiple sectors of the economy. And this TPLF domination led to mounting and particular unrest in the Oromia and Amhara region, which forced a leadership transition within the EPRDF and the new political party under Abiy, which ultimately resulted in civil war, during which the assets of Efford and Mesebo have actually been frozen, and the Mesebo cement factory was looted. So it's unclear exactly by whom, and it's certainly used by both parties for political, for their own political gains. But we also see similar regional distributional struggles play out in other parts of the Ethiopian cement sector. So in 2016, the Dangote country manager was murdered over a conflict of sourcing raw material inputs. So the Oromia state administration had tried to instate a legislation which would force Dangote and Durba to source certain additives used in cement manufacturing from local small-scale producers in Oromia, and well, that conflict hasn't resolved amicably. Right, I'm running out of time, so very briefly to conclude. So what I wanted to show was that construction has been a significant catalyst for manufacturing in all three countries, but it's by no means a self-sustaining process. So there's the issue of maintaining government spending, but also the issue of maximizing all of these potential spillover effects that there can be, right? And that ultimately involves managing various distributional conflicts between capitalists and workers, subsistence communities, right, over who gets which share in the rising value added, but also between large-scale and small-scale producers, between capitalists and rentiers or merchant capitalists, and even at the regional level, right? And what we've seen in all three examples is that these distributional conflicts have played out in a way that was and is limiting structural transformation in all three countries. I'm going to stop here, and we'll be happy to take questions.
Thank you so much, Christina. Very comprehensive picture across the three countries and about the links between construction and manufacturing. So we're going to again open up and collect some questions. I know there's a lot of discussion, great discussion going on about the previous paper still, but feel free to also add in the chat, but ideally to raise your hand with questions for Christina. Who would like to start? Lydia.
You're on mute, Lydia.
Yeah, just realized, clicked, but it didn't react. Well, thanks very much for a really interesting, detailed presentation. Really enjoyed it. I wanted to ask you, I don't know whether you were able to cover this, but I'm going to try anyway. If you've had the chance to look at China's I guess, narrative with regards to construction activities in these countries, the China's government narrative, whether there is any emphasis on the role that these activities play for broader developmental purposes, and whether you think this support, this potential support to structural transformation is happening you know, by desire or by accident? Is this part of, you know, yesterday we were talking about the Easternization of development. Is it part of China's attempt to support structural transformation, or this is happening because this is mainly being led by business interests? Any thoughts on that?
Thanks, Lydia. We have three now, so relatively succinct questions, if that's okay. So Emma, Joe, and then Pippa.
Thanks, Christina. That was really interesting. I suppose my question might be very similar to Lydia's. I was thinking about the kind of role of industrial policy, be it domestically, whether like how this intersects or not with any stated policy direction about some of those, say, distributional dimensions. And then the second being whether or not any of the Chinese actors, and I appreciate there's a very wide range of them, put this in terms of a Chinese, I know this is very, to say this very carefully, a Chinese approach or model. I appreciate that there isn't one and that's not what happens, but I wondered if there was any sort of sense in which Chinese actors draw on those debates in informing some of their involvement or not.
Thanks, Emma. Joe?
Oh yeah, this just one of the key issues being the out of these at the end. And I was just wondering if the original source of the project itself was a driver and had an impact on how the structural distribution ended up playing out in the longer term. So, you know, the sort of initial drivers of the different projects, whether that be Chinese funding or other funding, can you see any patterns in the results of the sort of distributional problems or outcomes?
Thanks, Joe. Pippa?
Hi, thank you so much for a great presentation. My question is pretty similar to some of the ones that have been raised previously, and relates to multiplier effects. So did you see any kind of differences in the multiplier effects depending on who is actually funding or investing in the project? And I'm thinking in particular of the Chinese government's tying of its funding to the use of Chinese entities versus perhaps you could imagine, for example, if the host government is funding a project, a construction project, they may be more able to use policy measures to kind of encourage multiplier effects, for example, by having local content requirements. So I'm just thinking, you know, do you see any differences based on who's actually funding the project? Thank you.
Thanks, Pippa. And finally, Barnaby, and then we'll go over to Christina.
Thanks. Yeah, my question builds off Pippa's. It's again about this, the sort of different policies that some of the financiers and companies might have regarding Chinese and local content, but also then if the practices have changed over time. So there's also something just about, I suppose, companies building up experience and therefore maybe wanting to use sort of more local suppliers for building materials and perhaps also supporting those over time. So yeah, thank you.
Thanks, Barnaby. Christina, if you're okay to take about, there's a wide range there, but maybe 3-4 minutes total to take what you can and on that.
All right, so I'll try my best to answer those. These are all really great questions, so sort of digging into deeper levels, unpacking the agency behind those, and in particular pointing at the Chinese and the African agency and how this relates to policy, right? So I'll try to address those, but they will necessarily be fairly superficial because the level of my study is more macro, right? So I'm not looking at individual projects and comparing individual projects. So some of the conclusions I just can't draw based on what I'm looking at. In terms of is there a Chinese narrative? So one thing I can say that there are Chinese policy efforts to promote setting up building materials and construction materials industries in the countries in which their construction firms operate. So there was a white paper in 2014, I think. I would have to dig it out. But there were these efforts on the part of the Chinese government. How systematic they are, once again, I cannot really comment on that, but it's certainly a great question. That leads me directly to Emma's question, not just about, you know, what is the Chinese agency, but also what is the African agency in answering this puzzle. Is it desire or accident, right? So there's certainly happening a lot of spillover effects by accident, and that we can clearly see at the example of Angola, where there wasn't really any industrial policy, yet it was just more profitable for the building materials to be produced domestically, partially because it's very heavy to ship over cement, right? So it's just more profitable to produce that locally. And even in the absence of an industrial policy, these sectors emerged and were then, you know, distributed across the political allies. Now, with an industrial policy in place, certainly more comes out of it, right? And more deeper linkages can be fostered and moves into different sectors can be supported. I suppose Ethiopia probably had the most comprehensive approach to industrial policy when it comes to building materials. They had very detailed plans how they can support local and small scale businesses. So not just the large building materials producers, but also the small scale producers like, I don't know, roofing structures or windows, door frames, that sort of thing. But all of these also, struggled in the end with the regional distributional, against the regional distributional struggles. In terms of does the source of funding or who carries out the project matter in terms of local content? Once again, this is where I can't really give a conclusive answer based on the evidence that I have. But my hunch is that no, precisely because a lot of these spillover effects are very macro. And as I said, a lot of them actually happened by accident more than by desire, just because it's more profitable to produce certain things domestically, right? And so in that sense, certainly you can reinforce it through domestic industrial policy and by acting on various distributional conflicts. But the project design itself and who carries it out, I'm not too sure that this makes a macro impact, or this has a macro impact. I'll leave it at that.
Thanks so much, Christina. And again, a really great set of questions asked, as well as a great paper. So we're now going to move on to the final paper of the session, which is Safa Jude from SOAS on Chinese zones in Africa. Safa, whenever you're ready, please start.
Thank you, Rory. I'm trying to find my presentation and to share it. Do you see it now?
Not yet.
Sorry, I've been experiencing some technical issues this morning. Let me try again.
Did you try doing the share screen and
I
choose the window?
Yeah, the PowerPoint isn't showing. So I'm on share screen, the green button, and then
you go on window.
It's just, for some reason, it's not showing. It didn't show up. It showed up eventually before in the trial, but.
So do you have your PowerPoint open in the background?
I do, yeah.
So it should show that. So you don't see it on the window?
No, let me just try to share the screen again. Sorry about this. Oh, right, here it is.
Yeah.
Now.
Yeah, just go to the slideshow. Perfect.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, Rory, for the introduction. Sorry about that. I'll jump right in. My presentation is based on my PhD research project, which examines opportunities for global value chain integration in the Egyptian-Chinese Suez Economic and Trade Cooperation Zone in Egypt. The Suez Zone was developed partly to allow the host government to learn from the Chinese experiment of using economic zones to facilitate development. My research examines the diverse and evolving relationships among different state and non-state actors to understand the extent to which the zone can contribute to Egypt's industrialization. It asks whether economic zone-based cooperation offers the Suez region an opportunity to strategically couple with Chinese-centric value chains in ways that facilitate inclusive growth and an improvement in standards of living. More broadly, I'm interested in whether an emerging framework for economic zone-based collaboration between Egypt and China converges or departs from the traditional terms for managing development partnerships imposed by leading international agencies. Just a brief overview of the broader framework for economic zone-based development that's advanced by global institutions. Globally linked zones are promoted across a range of institutional contexts as a leading strategy for low and middle income economies to promote development. The argument that underpins their rise is that increasing the competitiveness of locations will provide opportunities for local firms to upgrade in global value chains. The process of upgrading, the ability of firms to capture value, is posited by development institutions as both a means and an end to development. The focus on upgrading through value chains maintains and articulates a prior commitment to trade openness and private sector development, but it also advances beyond liberal market orthodoxies and incorporates strategies more commonly associated with government coordinated approaches to industrial development. Broadly speaking, upgrading interventions across institutional contexts express the need to remove inefficiencies and regulatory constraints facing foreign lead firms in order to encourage supplier linkages. By providing certain infrastructure and comprehensive support facilities for the entry of investors, zones have become a popular way to achieve this. So zones are one component of a more comprehensive turn towards state-oriented spatial planning and construction of large-scale infrastructure. They're widely used. There's 4,000 zones across 147 economies today, up from about 4,000 5 years ago. And increasingly, they're developed in a government-to-government context, government-to-government partnerships. So China launched its Overseas Economic and Trade Cooperation Zone program in this context in around 2006. And around the same time that globally linked zones were becoming a popular instrument in the international development landscape. It promoted the idea that through these platforms, its own investment flows can be harnessed to promote outcomes such as international competitiveness, growth, and employment. Given the growing consensus that zones reinforce the classical international division of labor, the question that arises is whether Chinese development practices abroad differ from economic development norms and practices that originate in the global north, and what are the prospects for types of domestic industrialization along the lines of China's experience as a result of coupling with Chinese value chains. The Chinese approach can be seen as one that embeds foreign production facilities while coordinating relations at the inter-firm level between foreign firms and Chinese suppliers through such measures as sectoral targeting and building the capacities of local firms. It's contrasted with the approach that focuses primarily on reducing transaction costs to lead firms in order to facilitate the development of supplier linkages. My case study, the Suez Economic and Trade Cooperation Zone, is one of 8 Chinese cooperation zones in 6 African countries, established in 2006 as part of China's Go Global strategy. It's a manufacturing-oriented industrial park located along the Gulf of Suez. It's built, managed, and developed by Egypt TIDA Investment Company, a joint venture between the government of Egypt and the Chinese developer Tianjin TIDA, a subsidiary of a Chinese provincial government. The Chinese policy to build overseas zones was based on the idea of following the model of successful economic zones in China. So theoretically, the Egyptian zone would be modeled after the Chinese developer, Tianjin Economic Technological Development Area. So TIDA's model focused on attracting economically and technologically advanced multinationals and followed a staged approach of transitioning from labor-intensive to technology-intensive production, and eventually producing for export markets with a total of over 800 export enterprises today in 7 industry clusters. The framework for cooperation between Egypt and China in the Egyptian zone emphasizes opening up and adopting FDI supporting policies such as heavy capital expenditure on fixed assets by the state, an incentive structure with strong protections for investors, deregulation of labor markets, and administrative facility for registering and operating businesses. It also emphasizes the capacity for upgrading and building the export capacity of Egyptian firms. However, there's an absence of tools to ensure local participation and to create opportunities for new entrants and for value capture, which might include addressing regulatory barriers faced by local manufacturers or introducing duty-free import schemes for export production or credit scheme for local suppliers. This suggests that China's approach in the Egyptian zone differs from its own definition of economic zone-based development, which is focused on sourcing technology and building local capacity. The Suez Zone's administrative and regulatory framework deploys a mainstream value chain-oriented model of zone planning, where their emphasis is on firm governance, and where the host location's role is to provide the optimal location and incentives for foreign firms as a means of incentivizing firm-to-firm cooperation. There are three main areas that construct this dynamic. The incentive structure. The zone is governed by the legislative and institutional framework for the wider Egyptian special economic zone that it's located in. It provides standard free zone incentives like duty-free imports on raw material, intermediate goods, dispute settlement, etc. It also grants independence to the zone's board of directors to negotiate with particular developers in the Egyptian zone to establish an incentive structure with customized preferential policies. Given the power asymmetries between actors in the host economy and their industrialized partner, having a flexible regulatory framework and near complete administrative autonomy in terms of management in the zone allows zone managers to structure business relationships in favor of Chinese investments and to restrict market access for domestic enterprises. In terms of infrastructure provision, on-site infrastructure is provided by the developer, but the areas surrounding the zone, off-site infrastructure, link roads, services extending water and electricity, and other types of infrastructure to facilitate transport links are all provided by the Egyptian contractual partner. Finally, production organization. There's 4 sectors in the zone that range from heavy industry to low-skill assembly-oriented activity. The initial master plan for the zone proposed matching the industry clusters with the local industrial context. But once established, they were mainly geared towards incoming enterprises rather than the existing industrial base. Almost 30 or 40 manufacturing enterprises located in the zone are Chinese owned and support supply chains of firms in the Chinese national economy. This creates the condition that enables lead firms in China to retain control of various stages of the supply chain. Because of this, enterprises in the zone are almost exclusively Chinese investments, with the exception of 3 joint ventures with state-owned enterprises. And opportunities for domestic firms to locate there are limited. These dynamics demonstrate that the Suez Zone promotes the exclusionary access of Chinese firms and suppliers to productive economic space while regulating access to most local firms. This indicates that China deploys mainstream methods and tools to boost investments in the Egyptian zone in pursuit of strategic objectives. Patterns of cross-border production in which the key organizing principle is intra-firm collaboration allows Chinese firms to achieve the status of multinational production, or the ability to operate across different markets cost effectively, which helps improve the position and competitiveness of Chinese producers while relieving the saturated domestic markets. Beyond that, the zone acts as an exclusive Chinese manufacturing base in a highly strategic location, offering trade route connectivity, a transit route for oil and liquefied natural gas, shipments across East Asia, and proximity of Chinese petroleum equipment manufacturers to oil and gas firms. There are various mechanisms for the central government to retain its influence. Equity financing. The Chinese government is a major shareholder in Egyptida. The company is majority Chinese owned with a minority stake by a consortium of Egyptian state-owned developers. Within the Chinese portion, there's equity participation of China Africa Development Fund, a national venture capital instrument, which together with the municipal Tianjin Investment Holdings Company controls 75% of Egyptida's shares. and the 5% here is owned by a company controlled by Tianjin TIDA. Diverse mechanisms of support. Both the developer and the enterprises locating in the zone receive support from central ministries and central government instruments. The zone also receives political backing from the Ministry of Foreign Affairs and the Ministry of Commerce. Finally, the central government has a say in the terms of the agreement between the zone developer and the host government. So when the developer first submits an expression of interest to Chinese ministries, the Ministry of Commerce asks the developer to document the market potential and the investment environment and the types of support from the host government for Chinese firms, and they must meet certain criteria. This includes issues such as incentive structure, quota of exports to domestic markets and access to regional markets, and foreign employee quotas. So to conclude, there are 2 points that emerge from the analysis. First, economic zone-based cooperation in the Suez zone supports China's national industrialization and development objectives, and at a micro level, Chinese firms play a significant role in China's foreign economic policymaking. The second point is that there's obviously many ways in which host countries can shape their external relations, but this is a discussion on China's main policy priorities that are advanced through its zone program. And the case study supports the argument that when international firms take over the process of coordinating economic activity, upgrading efforts actually tend to diminish or disappear. Therefore, resources and subsidies offered by governments in economic zones amount to massive value transfers to foreign firms with limited impact on development. And I'll stop here, and I'm happy to receive feedback. I apologize beforehand because I've been sick for a few days, so not my usual level of energy.
Thank you, Safa. And if you're okay to stop sharing the screen. Oh, thank you, you've already done. Okay, thanks, Safa. Very detailed account of the zone dynamics. So again, happy to we'll collect a few questions for Safa this time. If you'd like to raise the hand or post it in the chat, preferably raise the hand. Okay, so I'll ask, so I guess in terms of GVC integration, I mean, you mentioned at the end particularly about Chinese industrialization. So, I mean, what if any really is the benefit for local firms, and is this zone primarily, I mean, it's even linking back slightly to the previous paper to me, I feel like some of these dynamics can in a way basically facilitate imports, and what Chinese firms are really looking to do in to the most degree is basically import as much as possible. So yeah, in short, local firms and local impacts, if you can just elaborate on that a little bit more.
Local firms?
Yeah.
Well, given that the opportunities to access and locate inside the zone for local firms are limited, that decreases the likelihood of supplier linkages developing. There are cases where there's production cooperation between Egyptian companies and Chinese firms, but it's mostly political arrangements, state-owned enterprises that enter with equity and receive revenues, but have no sort of involvement in the day-to-day operation in the zone or in terms of production in these firms, especially in the heavy industry sector. There's localization in terms of labor, but most of the industries that locate in the zone are labor-intensive, low technology, and so there's very little in terms of skills transfer. when supplier linkages do exist in sort of low-level production, it's sort of arm's length relationships with firms in very low complexity sort of production and no type of standards performance requirements. So there's very little scope for local firms to benefit anything. Relationships can change overnight depending on how cost effective it is for Chinese firms to partner with local Egyptian firms. So this is by design. It's sort of written into the cooperation agreements. Financing cooperation ensures the concentration of Chinese capital and decision making, and there's very little impact for either Egyptian actors, authorities, the zone authority, or non-state actors to really have any say or involvement in either at the regulation level or in terms of relationships, interfirm relationships.
Okay, thanks, Safa. There's two questions that have come up in the chat also. If anybody wants to raise hand, feel free. So Ayuna is asking, I mean, related, is there any clustering appearing in the zone? Do they predominantly produce a certain type of goods, or is it rather random?
There is clustering. The zone adopts a sort of cluster strategy based on the model that's of the Tianjin development zone. The clusters, I think, are heavy industry, electrical equipment, fiberglass, textile. I always forget the fourth one, machinery. And they're mainly determined by sort of the types of firms that are coming in, the type of FDI that's coming in, the Chinese firms that locate in the zone. There is clustering between Chinese firms. Sometimes Chinese firms bring in their own suppliers. One of the largest fiberglass manufacturing plants in the Middle East, Jushi, has its own suppliers for I guess, component parts and chemicals that also import raw material directly from China. There's clustering around the zone of Egyptian firms, an existing industrial base in Suez, mostly in the auto sector. And the initial sort of promotion of the zone advertisement was to integrate the existing industrial base into sort of links and chains that are anchored by lead firms in China. But this never materialized, and the situation ended up with a sort of a Chinese manufacturing base that is basically an enclave development that's disconnected from the global, from the local economy and very much linked into global circuits, because one of the main advantages of the zone is for China to be able to access Egyptian trade agreements through Egyptian certificates of origin, giving China access to markets in Europe, in the transatlantic area, in the Middle East. So the links with the zone are primarily outside, external, with some firms exporting to the domestic market, but there's no integration or disaggregation or any type of link development with local industry.
Thanks, Safa. And Lydia has a question about whether the zone is formally part of Belt and Road or whether it precedes it.
It does precede it, but I believe Egypt is the Egyptian zone is one of the zones that's a beneficiary of the Belt and Road initiative, and it's been sort of subsumed and incorporated with it. And the language changes, the discourse around the zone changes depending on the initiative that it falls under. Construction began in the 90s, way before the sort of go global agenda was launched. And throughout the years, there's been sort of a change in the sort of strategic direction, but it's maintained the same pattern of disconnection from the local economy.
And then one for Ayuna there about any type of spillovers happening in terms of local workers, taxes, etc.
The type of work is low-level, precarious type of employment, and there's a huge turnover in terms of workers, and no actual skills to be transferred that could be beneficial. Even in terms of small things like maintenance of machinery and equipment, there is no type of training program to allow this to happen locally. Everything's shipped back to China, so no.
Okay, any other questions? I'll ask one more if it's okay. So I guess you mentioned, I mean, a lot of details on the zone, but also in relation to global value chains and that kind of theoretical engagement. What do you see as the kind of main story in relation to global value chains and the benefit of engaging conceptually with work on global value chains for this case, understanding this case?
I think it's a matter of, the question comes down to the level of sort of public policy involvement in terms of regulating and directing the way that interfirm relationships develop. And you know, there's different institutional approaches on a global scale, sort of value chain paradigm level, between an approach that takes a sort of light touch approach, or assigns the state a sort of light touch role of providing the infrastructure and the incentive structure, and sort of relying on lead firms and incentivizing lead firms to develop these linkages. And there's another approach that focuses on the supplier base itself and developing capacity within the supplier base, and use diagnostic tools to measure different sort of areas of impact that the interfirm relationships might have, and that the government might wish to develop beyond employment and growth, capacity building of local firms, etc. And so employing these diagnostic tools and focusing on providing things like credit schemes and duty-free import schemes for local firms to facilitate the linkages. And so this is sort of in a broader value chain sort of paradigm. From that perspective, it would be what type of linkages to develop between local firms and global sort of lead firms, and what can be a more equitable way to foster these relationships in a way that doesn't create the unevenness and the exploitation that we see in global value chains today.
Okay, thank you. No, I was thinking in terms of I think there's some useful parallels with other work on trade regimes and trade policy and global value chains, in terms of particularly you're talking about trade preferences and how they're so key for Chinese firms' sort of desire to be present in this zone to take advantage of those elsewhere. So anyway, there's definitely some relevant work on GVCs and that might be useful. Laura's asking if your work is in print anywhere.
I have one working paper.
Okay. Somewhere, many outlets soon. Okay. Laura's looking forward to reading it. Okay. I think, thanks, Safa, really great paper, and thanks for dealing with all those questions as well. 3 really good papers. Happy to open up for the last 5 minutes if anybody has either comments or questions that go back to earlier papers or broader reflections on the 3 papers together in relation to rising powers. But of course, China has been the particular rising power under focus in this session. So if anybody would like to come in with any reflective comment, please do. or does anybody have, in particular, I think there was a lot of ongoing chat about Hui and May's paper that we moved on to the next paper for. Do Hui and May, would you like to add anything in relation to some of that subsequent discussion, or would anybody else like to add on a question to that, or of course in Christina's paper as well? Joe.
Maybe just to say that it was really interesting, that the whole framing and all the papers were really interesting. And it's funny because it's quite often we look at rising powers compared to, you know, traditional or a northern way of doing things. And it's just interesting to see how we can sometimes accidentally drift into assuming that there is this sort of traditional or northern way of doing things, and our rising powers being socialized by global norms. And I know Emma, who's here previously, has done a lot on this, but it's it just sort of re-begs the question that, you know, well, where do you see anybody really applying these global norms and sort of prioritizing the countries that they're working in? Does that ever really happen? You know, is it a case of, yes, socializing them towards these great OECD DAC ways of doing things? Where can you ever really see that happen in practice, whether it's rising powers or in the global north? A bit cynical, sorry.
A useful comment, Joe. Thank you. Anybody else? May.
Yeah.
May at 3:45 a.m.
Yes, can you hear me?
Yeah.
Yeah, no, I was just thinking that's such a great point, because I mean, I think, and China has been the focus in the papers today. I think one underlying question maybe is, you know, that those of us who think about China should be always have present in our mind is what's really distinctive here about Chinese aid, investment, or even the operation of northern donors. In that, is there anything distinctive in what these, you know, these actors are doing, and how much of it is the packaging or the but that in itself is also an interesting question. So if it's not the global norms that are being socialized, the rhetoric or some rhetoric around that makes more palatable, you know, some of these activities, how that's being socialized or how that's being adopted, I think is in itself interesting to look at.
Thanks, May. Indra.
Yeah, I think the papers raise this very important question of reciprocal socialization, which I really appreciated. We've been attuned to thinking that socialization works one way, with the North or the West socializing the rest, or the most, take your pick. But I think for good or for ill, it's a two-way process, or perhaps a multi-way process. And I really think that's a point that needs to be that we need to take away. It was very clear from the first paper, but it's also a theme that runs through the other papers, and more generally, I suppose, in the work that this study group does. So it's definitely something to look out for.
Anybody else? Joe again, or is it? Yeah.
Sorry, just one. Yeah, I do agree with that. But then at some point, I wonder whether it is a case of multiply directional socialization, or whether everything really does just boil down to political economy, and it the global norms just go, you know, are played when they want to be played by whichever actor, and are not played when they don't want to be played by whichever, you know, when we talk about them, it's sort of individual, you know, sort of talk about China or Beijing or the global north or anything, whereas in fact, you know, you need to be talking about the owner of the cement factory, or the you know, the who is currently Isabel dos Santos's favorite at the moment. So, you know, you can pick and choose from an entire range of global, local, national level norms, and you can get socialized whether you're in the global north or the global south. But you know, maybe depending on where, you know, yeah, how close you are to the global elite and what norms you particularly want to pick up and put down at that particular moment is what really impacts decisions and outcomes.
Thanks, Joe. Indra again.
Yeah, no, I would totally agree with that. I think that's why I think it's an important point. It's not just reciprocal socialization between North and South, but I suppose between states and social actors as well. It's states influencing what business elites do, and business elites influencing what states do. So I think there's just a lot going on. It's just how you analytically unpick the different strands, I guess, that matters. So I wouldn't disagree with anything, but it's just to say that there are several directions of socialization.
And on that point, maybe a good way to conclude that we've had 3 papers here, which I think through their own angles have looked at different specific ways of unpacking these broader South-South relations, and of course some involvement of North too, and through specific actors in specific countries doing various different types of activities. We will have another 3 set of papers starting at 2:15. 4 papers, sorry, at 2:15 on particularly related to COVID responses and South-South relations. But for now, thank you everybody in particular for all of the really varied and rich set of contributions in the comments, and of course as well to the 4 presenters, Hui and May, Christina and Safa. So thanks everybody, and see hopefully many of you at 2:15 UK time this afternoon. Maybe some people will get some sleep after this, and anyway, in different time zones, other people will do other things, but hope to see many of you back again in a few hours' time.